calling out Stephanie White for her defensive game plan and the stupid mistakes and things she keeps going back to after seeing they don't work.
Listen to this. Listen to what Caitlin Clark just said into a live microphone on camera in front of every reporter in that room about her own coaching staff, about her own defensive scheme, about the exact same broken system that has been losing this team games all season long.
And we kind of went back to our old ways where that second rotation we didn't get, and then they scored off the 90 cuts and the 45.
We kind of went back to our old ways where that second rotation we didn't get, and then they scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts. That is not a vague, diplomatic, say-nothing answer designed to protect the coaching staff. That is Caitlin Clark naming the exact defensive breakdown by name, by mechanism, by failure point in real time, on the record after a loss, with the cameras rolling. And what happened in that press room in the minutes immediately after those words left her mouth is the moment this entire season's tension finally became impossible to manage quietly.
See that? We went right back to the old defense where nobody's rotating. We're playing one-on-one. There's no help. There's no rotations.
Because the next reporter to step to that podium was Stephanie White. And sources in that room describe her as visibly, audibly, unmistakably pissed off. Not composed, not measured. Not the careful, deflecting, whole group resilience energy she usually brings to that podium. Something different. Something that looked a lot like a head coach who had just been publicly contradicted by her own franchise player and was not handling it well in front of the cameras. But here's what nobody is connecting. This was not a one-time blow-up. This wastes off the moment an entire season of philosophical disagreement between Clark and White stopped being something fans had to infer from rotation data and finally became something Clark said out loud, on the record, in a way that left Stephanie White with nowhere left to hide. To understand the full weight of what happened in that press room, you have to understand the specific game that produced it because this was not just another regular season loss. This was Caitlin Clark's sneaker debut day, a moment that should have been a celebration, a commercial milestone, a cultural moment, the kind of day that gets circled on a marketing calendar months in advance. Instead, it became a documented disaster. 26-7 going into the fourth quarter. Then nothing. The exact same 26-7 sitting on the stat sheet at the final buzzer because Clark fouled out of her own milestone game that on the day her signature shoe debuted, in front of cameras specifically there to document a commercial celebration that turned into documentation of an organizational collapse instead. Why was Clark in foul trouble? The answer is not complicated, and it is not flattering to the coaching staff responsible for the system she was operating inside. Teams have been hunting her all season, targeting her specifically, attacking her at every opportune moment, knowing that the Indiana Fever's defensive structure leaves her isolated and exposed in exactly the situations that produce cheap fouls. And on the single biggest commercial day of her season, that exact vulnerability got exploited at the worst possible moment. Clark knew it. She watched it happen in real time from the inside of a defensive scheme that had already failed this exact same way, in this exact same way. Same fashion against multiple other opponents earlier in the season. And when the post-game press conference arrived, she did not protect the coaching staff from that reality. Let's slow down and actually examine what Caitlin Clark said at that podium, because the precision of her language is what makes this moment so explosive. She did not vaguely gesture at team struggles. She did not deploy the standard athlete deflection of "we need to be better collectively." She named the specific defensive mechanism that broke down, identified exactly when it broke down, and connected it directly to a pattern that had already failed against multiple opponents this season.
We know the Indiana Fever took a disgusting loss to the Atlanta Dream in Caitlin Clark's sneaker debut day in a game where she was absolutely going off 26-7 going into the fourth quarter, and then she finishes the game with 26-7 due to foul trouble.
Read that statement again with full attention to what it actually contains. We're going to have to rotate at some point. That sentence alone is a direct critique of a defensive philosophy that resists rotation. We kind of went back to our old ways. That phrase, old ways, is Clark explicitly identifying that this is not a new problem. This is a recurring, previously identified, previously failed defensive approach that the coaching staff returned to anyway, and then she finished with the data. They scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts. Specific basketball terminology identifying the exact cutting patterns that exploited the gap in Indiana's defensive rotation. This is not an emotional post-game reaction. This is the precise, technical, basketball-literate breakdown of a coaching failure delivered by the player who had to live inside that failure for 40 minutes.
A lot of times, that's probably on us guards, getting into the ball a little bit better so we don't have to rotate, but I think we could have done a little bit better.
Everybody on their team shot over 50%. Clark did not stop at her own observation. She referenced a teammate Kelsey Mitchell independently arriving at the same conclusion about the same defensive collapse. That detail matters enormously because it means this is not Clark's isolated frustration. This is multiple players inside that Indiana Fever locker room recognizing the same systemic defensive failure and naming it publicly in the same press conference. When the entire opposing roster shoots over 50% from the field, that is not bad luck. That is not a string of unfortunate bounces. That is a defensive system that is structurally failing to contest shots, structurally failing to rotate, and structurally failing to make any opponent uncomfortable on a single possession across 40 minutes of basketball. Clark identified the mechanism. Mitchell confirmed the conclusion independently, and the next person scheduled to address the media was the coach responsible for the system both of them had just publicly criticized. Here's what makes this moment more than just a single bad press conference. Because Clark's comments did not appear out of nowhere. They are the latest and most explicit entry in a season-long pattern of philosophical disagreement between Clark and Stephanie White about how this defense should actually be played. And the disagreement is not subtle once you know what to listen for.
Essentially everybody on their team shot over 50%. It's really hard to win a basketball game when that's the case.
Listen to the specific language Clark is using. Our one-on-one D, our defensive failings. She is describing a defensive philosophy guard, your own player, no help, no rotation, react only after the catch, and identifying it directly as the cause of Indiana's defensive struggles across the season. This is not a single game's breakdown. This is Clark describing a recurring systemic approach that has produced recurring systemic failures. And here is the part that makes Stephanie White's reaction in that press room so significant. Stephanie White's public coaching philosophy, the one she has repeatedly emphasized in her own press conferences across the season, has consistently centered on individual defensive responsibility. Guard your matchup. Win your one-on-one battle. Trust your individual defender to contain dribble penetration without requiring a help rotation that takes a defender away from their own assignment. Clark is describing the exact opposite conclusion from the exact same defensive results. She is saying the one-on-one approach is the problem, that rotations are necessary, that the team needs to commit to helping each other rather than relying on individual containment. That has repeatedly failed against fast, perimeter-oriented opponents who exploit exactly the gaps that a no-help system creates. Two people, same locker room, same defensive results. Completely opposite conclusions about what those results mean and what should change because of them. That is not a minor disagreement about rotation timing. That is a fundamental philosophical collision about how professional basketball defense should be played. And it had been building under the surface for an entire season before Clark finally said it explicitly, with specific in camera after a loss on her own sneaker debut day. Now we arrive at the moment everyone watching this story has been waiting for. Stephanie White's turn at the podium. She had just heard or would have known about within minutes, given how quickly post-game quotes circulate among reporters and coaching staff in the same building, exactly what her franchise player had said about the defensive system she designed and continues to deploy. A direct, specific, technically precise public critique of her coaching philosophy, delivered by the most important player in the history of this franchise on a day that was supposed to be a celebration. Sources in that press room describe White's demeanor as visibly different from her standard post-game composure. Pissed off, not performing the careful, controlled, message-disciplined version of herself that she typically brings to that podium. Something raw, something that looked a lot like a coach who had just watched her own player publicly dismantle her defensive philosophy in front of the same media room she was about to walk into. And what White reportedly did at that podium was exactly what the pattern of this entire season predicted she would do. She did not address Clark's specific critique. She did not acknowledge the rotation breakdown Clark had just named in technical detail. She returned to the same defensive talking points: individual responsibility, guard your matchup, one-on-one containment that Clark had just identified as the actual source of the problem. The disconnect was not subtle. It was not something that required careful analysis to notice. The most important player in the building had just explained exactly why the system was failing. And the coach responsible for that system stood at the same podium minutes later and defended the exact philosophy that had just been publicly criticized, visibly frustrated, audibly tense, and unwilling to engage with the specific critique that had just been delivered. That disconnect, Clark naming the problem with precision, White defending the system that created it, while visibly agitated about having to do so, is the single clearest public demonstration the season has produced of an organization where the franchise player and the head coach are simply not seeing the same basketball game. What makes this press conference moment so significant is that it is not isolated. It is the public confirmation of a pattern that has been documented across multiple games this season, a pattern that Clark herself directly referenced in her own post-game comment.
One-on-one D, that was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings. It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for them.
Our one-on-one defense. Why are we playing one-on-one the whole time? Now, I get it on straight line blow-bys. I understand that. But you had plays where people are putting the ball on the floor, dribble, and nobody is stepping over to help at any point in time. Why would you go back to this when you saw this did not work?
Them to pass the ball around the perimeter, and they're fast. When they catch it on the run and attack our feet, we're already behind.
To specific previous opponents, named directly Golden State, Portland. Both games where this exact defensive approach, the one-on-one containment system with minimal help rotation, had already failed in a documented, visible way, and the coaching staff returned to that same system against Atlanta on Clark's sneaker debut day and watched it fail in exactly the same fashion for a third time. This is the detail that should alarm anyone evaluating Stephanie White's coaching performance with genuine objectivity. Coaching staff that returns to a previously failed system multiple times across a season without adjustment, without acknowledgement, without apparent willingness to incorporate the feedback that its own franchise player has been providing in real time during games is not demonstrating coaching stubbornness as a competitive virtue. It is demonstrating an inability or unwillingness to adapt that is directly costing this team winnable basketball games. The specific defensive vulnerability Clark identified: the failure to execute second rotations, allowing opponents to exploit cutting patterns through gaps that a properly rotating defense would close, is not a complex or obscure basketball concept. It is fundamental defensive principle.